Sometimes, what may seem so normal could be everything but normal, and other times, they might just really be normal. But if there is one thing you should know in these next clips, nothing is normal. This is arguably the perfect crime. It was so perfect that he was never found because he jumped right out of the airplane. It's not a joke. Check this video out.
This man committed the perfect crime. On November 24th, 1971, a man who went by the name of Dan Cooper boarded a Northwest Airlines flight from Portland to Seattle. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper slipped a note to the stewardess demanding $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He then calmly said, "Miss, I have a bomb," and directed her to sit in the seat next to him. The plane then landed in Seattle, and airline employees delivered the cash and parachutes to him, while Cooper allowed all the passengers to disembark. Shortly after that, he demanded to be flown southeast towards Mexico City. After the second takeoff, Cooper told the air stewardess to go to the cockpit and stay there with the door closed. Moments later, the light flashed, indicating the airplane door had been opened, and Cooper was never seen again. Till today, DB Cooper remains at large. That is why
aliens have been seen repeatedly on Earth. Well, not them, but UFOs. And the strangest thing about this is the period they are usually seen the most. It is usually during a period of war when there is a threat of nuclear weapons being used. Why? See this clip.
Aliens are actually monitoring us. Alien sightings have been fairly common and commonly written off. However, if you notice the trend in which sightings increase, it's usually during war periods where there's a threat of nuclear war. There was a spike in UFO sightings when World War II was ongoing. And recently with the war in Ukraine, the UFO sightings have spiked again. There's a theory that the reason for the increased UFO sightings is that the aliens are monitoring us. Because a nuclear war is not just bad for our planet, but bad for theirs as well. Upon the threat of a nuclear war, the aliens will descend to assess the threat of their own planets. That's why theorists believe that the
alien bases on the moon? This man claims he once saw alien bases on the far side of the moon. Not just that, but they have been monitoring the consciousness of humans. And the US government was in full awareness of the presence of the aliens. Fact or crap?
Did this man spot alien bases on the moon? Ingo Swann was a remote viewer and psychic who worked for the US government on top-secret projects during the Cold War. Swann claimed that during one of his remote viewing sessions, he was able to see alien bases on the far side of the moon. He described the structures as massive and intricate with clear signs of activity. According to Swann, the aliens had been observing Earth for thousands of years, and they had a particular interest in human consciousness. He also claimed that the US government knew about the alien bases and was covering up the truth. Swann's claims were met with skepticism by many, but he remained steadfast in his beliefs. While his claims may seem far-fetched, they raise important questions about the possibility of extraterrestrial life and the extent to which the government may be hiding the truth from us, and that makes us wonder.
This clip would show you that no matter how much money you are born into or how much money you make, people would eventually forget you. But that is not all the clip is about.
What does billions of dollars, hemp, the Great Depression, and both popular political parties of the US all have in common? William Randolph Hearst, who proves it doesn't matter how much money you were born into and eventually make, people will forget about you, even when you own the most popular news article outlet. He was an outspoken devout Democrat and was associated with helping the working class from 1904 to 1910. And then, all of a sudden, became an outspoken Republican from 1911 to 1951, 1918 being the year he would become conservative, but he did still support Franklin D. Roosevelt for a while, but eventually became described as a nationalist and an anti-communist. He hated the UK, France, Japan, and actually pretty much everyone, but he was well liked by his new party. That is until he dropped his loyalty for FDR, who was always regarded as a top 3 president in US history, for doing things like creating a minimum wage and pulling an economy out of the worst collapse ever. But as William turned against FDR, his party turned against him. So even though he was hated by mostly everyone, by 1928, he had what would today equate to $30 billion, from becoming pretty much the father of tabloids, papers with huge headlines about crime, sexual mishaps, and corruption, to scare people into reading them. His craft was so perfect, he was the #1 seller of newspapers, and wouldn't you know, is the man credited to creating a long-lasting myth in cannabis. His major investments in paper would be catastrophic if he didn't stop the emerging hemp industry. So William and Harry teamed up to create hemp propaganda, in order to get it banned to save his profits. Yet, he still fell victim to the Great Depression, and as more people starved to death, they didn't really care about semantics or drama, and were more receptive to taking handouts from a liberal government to, not die by starvation during the worst economic collapse to ever exist. Also, William was terrible with money, and was in a massive amount of debt. He eventually had to sell his exotic animals, expensive art, precious metals, his jewelry, nearly all of his houses and property, most of his expensive collectibles, and pretty much everything, and gave his money to a trustee, who made his salary $500K a year. But when he sold those items, he also sold them at a loss.
It has not been easy for me, and I started off in Brooklyn. My father gave me a small loan of $1 million.
Though he did barely secure 2 loans for $1 million apiece to avoid bankruptcy so they wouldn't take his failing paper business, and by 1938, his net worth was negative by the million. Even Time magazine exposed him for being at risk for defaulting on his mortgage, going from a man with many properties to a man who couldn't even afford to live on his own single property. He was still acting all elitist though, but everyone knew he was losing money by the second, especially the other rich people like the Rockefellers, who was buying all his junk. He was barely hanging on to his newspaper business when World War II happened, and we all know how profitable war is for the rich, especially when they destroy a competing industry in the process, skyrocketing his revenue once again. From 1940 to 1946, he spent most of his time on a Siskiyou County estate that I just passed a few months ago, but he only enjoyed his money for 6 years until he was too weak to work in 1947, and he had to be taken to Beverly Hills and eventually died in 1951. The events of the war, and people wanting to know what was happening around the world, secured the money they needed, and the Hearst family is now worth around $30 billion. So this man was the original clickbait, fear-mongering headline producer, and the man that made weed illegal, helping America tear in 2 parts. He put $30 billion in his pocket, but probably took away $1 trillion worth of profit the US could have made all these years. When all said and done, I'd call this guy a net negative.
In this clip, you would see the top 3 rare pictures from all of history. It is not just that the pictures are rare, it is also about the story behind these pictures and how they came to be.
Top 3 rare photos from history. Number 3, during a little spoken about mass genocide that had started and lasted for over a year. It happened so quick, and there were so many dead, the original rough estimate was around tens of thousands to 500,000 deaths, but now that figure stands as 500,000 being the low, to upwards of 3 million people killed. And they were killed for being Communist Party members, in preparation of the New Order of Political Conservatives. This picture was taken moments before the mass execution and dismemberment. Number 2, the oldest existing photo of a Native American, depicting a man known as Chief Keokuk, most likely being the first because of his well-known cooperation with the colonizers at the time. Despite signing over land multiple times to keep the white settlers from killing his people, he and the Sauk tribe were forcibly moved time and time again from their land that still continued after his deals. And number 1, Kim Il-sung, grandfather to Kim Jong-un, a North Korean president, noticed a baseball-sized tumor on the back of his neck. When it first manifested, he banned all photographers from taking pictures that included it, and then started taking all of his pictures turning to the left. Once it was too hard to hide, all of his photos were airbrushed before they were released to the public to keep up the facade of perfection he was known so well for.
You could take a trip with your friends, decide to take pictures, and when you get home, you notice something extremely strange in the pictures. That isn't a face, is it?
You guys do send me a lot of pictures in my DMs, and truthfully, I do check through a lot of those. Michael, if you are watching, the pictures you sent me caught my eye. So he had sent me a series of pictures that he described were taken when him and his friends went to go explore an abandoned building. And that's exactly what this series of photos looked like, but there was one in particular that stood out. But before we jump in, if you are a fan of all things chilling, mysterious, and unexplained, please go check out my podcast, Creep Time the Podcast. The link right in my bio, and also I made this ad today myself. Isn't it so good? Come on. Okay, let's get back to the picture. That photo that sent chills down my spine. Can't be 100% of what I'm looking at, but that looks like a face. That looks like a face, and this is a real picture. Didn't give me any further information about anything strange that happened. It seems like they just took these photos and then caught this oddity later. Wanted to illustrate for you just how clearly I see this in this picture.
What would seem like a normal suitcase turned out to be something so inhumane and scary. I mean, how do you explain the concept of dismembering body parts and packaging them into different suitcases?
Explaining the backstory to viral videos. Cannot be that bad. Honey, don't you love me and you know it makes me sad.
If you've seen enough of my videos, you probably think you know what's in that suitcase, but you're wrong. In May of 2004, several pieces of luggage washed up on a shore in Virginia, each case containing the body parts of an unidentified person. Immediately, an investigation was launched, and a facial reconstruction of the body led to Melanie McGuire. Melanie, who was having an affair with her boss, had purchased a gun and shot her husband Bill multiple times. She then dismembered his body, packed it into 3 separate suitcases, and dumped them into Chesapeake Bay. And on July 19, 2007, at the age of 34, Melanie McGuire was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Like our last clip, these two individuals look like a normal family. Or do they? Well, whether they did or did not, turns out things were far from normal and one was a psychopath. Find out more.
The couple seemed like a normal, typical family on the outside.
No, they didn't.
Agreed. These two look like psychopaths, and spoiler alert, one of them actually was. After 18 years of an unhappy marriage, Marilyn Depew filed for divorce from her husband Dennis. He was only allowed to see his 3 children twice a week, and when he went to go pick them up on Easter Day, they refused, causing him and Marilyn to get into an intense argument. He blamed her for ruining his life and proceeded to push Marilyn down the stairs, causing her to receive several injuries. Dennis then loaded her into his car and told his kids that he was taking their mom to the hospital. However, the next day, 2 siblings were driving down the road when they came across a man holding a white sheet soaked in blood. They called the police, who discovered Marilyn's body in a nearby forest with gunshot wounds to the back of her head. After, they tracked Dennis down for over a year until he took his own life in a standoff with police.
Even if you are not an animal life activist, after this video, you might get to understand the viewpoint of those calling for the banning of flashlight cameras in aquariums.
These are videos humans were never meant to see, part 23. Okay, so there was a bunch of people at an aquarium enjoying the day and being amazed by the fish they're looking at. But one person then took a picture of the fish, and the flash of the camera blinded the fish, making it slam itself into the glass and killing itself. This is absolutely disturbing, and now aquariums are calling to ban flash cameras.
Do you relate to any of these videos? Tell us about it in the comments.